Hey everyone, this is Chris, your video feature producer here at 4Player, and finally, this is my list of my top 10 games of 2018. For years now, I've had to endure the likes of Brad, Nolan, Yeager, and more, who have repeatedly spouted their love for the action brawler comedy drama series Yakuza. Despite, conservatively speaking, roughly 140,000 discussions and mentions on the podcast, Discord, and beyond, I hadn't really felt compelled to try a Yakuza game before this year. In April, however, Sega's Yakuza team finally released their latest numbered entry to the rest of the world, complete with a brand new engine and the promise of one of their strongest stories to date. With this in mind, and the mentions over and over and over and over again of Yakuza 0 still ringing in my ears from last year's Podcast Awards videos, I decided to make Yakuza 6 my first foray into the series. After 40 hours of gameplay, I came away mostly satisfied with my experience. Yakuza 6, as it turns out, is pretty much exactly what I've been described and led to believe about every other entry in the series. A nicely written character drama filled to the brim with gangster politics, absolutely brutal combat, and a cacophony of comedic side stories all centered around one man, Kazuma Kiryu, who is probably both the nicest and most naive happenstance character this side of Forrest Gump. In between bouts with drunkards, delinquents, and rival Yakuza, Kazuma kept getting dragged into one more strange side quest after another, all the while being the almost sole charge of his adopted daughter's infant son, Haruto. Across dozens of hours of mainline story, you got strong gangster intrigue and drama, and when you decided to take a break from that, Kiryu would get roped into a hilarious assortment of missions, from helping a pervert get his next fix with a live chat porn star, to a rogue sentient AI installed on Kiryu's phone, which has less than good intentions, to even playing the part of a small port town's anthropomorphized mascot for children. There was always something potentially delightful around the corner. I enjoyed my time with Yakuza 6 this year, and despite some minor complaints about world design and pacing, I think I'm in it for the next entry in the series. I find it a bit strange that I'm the only one on the staff putting this game on their list this year, but given how jam-packed 2018 was, it's not that surprising. To say that we're not fans of the Stay of Decay franchise around here will be nothing short of a lie. In a world overflowing with zombie games, which shows no sign of slowing growth anytime soon, Stay of Decay 1 attempted a different and far more interesting approach to the formula by looking at a zombie world scenario and focusing it entirely on resource management, exploration, and community survival. Instead of going from level to level, wiping out hordes of the undead, you instead were stationed with a group of talented survivors at a homestead in the middle of a rural county where the goal is simple. Scavenge, build up your defenses, and survive as long as you can. Filled with smart subsystems and a ton to explore and do, Stay of Decay 1 was one of my favorite games back in 2013, so being excited for its long-awaited follow-up was a no-brainer. Pun unintended. What we got with this sequel was, well, more Stay of Decay. To many, that seems to be something more of a disappointment than anything else, but I found myself delightfully entertained, so much so that I put in more than 2 full runs in it before E3 arrived and I became woefully distracted. It didn't help that the game's launch was unfortunately quite bug-ridden, but if you get past the problems that have at this point been pretty much patched out, you'll find the same deep gameplay mechanics and systems of the first game, but this time with an emphasis on online cooperative play and expanded replayability. My first run was honestly not as fun as I hoped it would be, thanks to the game's story focus on dark hearts, zombie hives which are basically spreading the infection. But after completing the story and being prompted for my second run, I was presented with a number of upgrades and items I could carry over that made me completely change my process of playing the next map. In that second run was where I think the game really begins to shine. I think it's a shame that almost everyone fell off before then. State of Decay 2 may not be the sequel many of us anticipated it to be, nor expect it after 5 years of development, but dang if it isn't a good game at its heart. I'm determined to return to it one day and explore all the post-release content that has come out and finish my eventual third run. One day, but not anytime soon. The sequel to Rockstar's Western darling from 2010 has been a long, long time coming. 9 years and a whole console cycle ago, Red Dead Redemption was the remarkable answer to the question of whether games featuring the Wild West would ever see a truly solid story-driven experience. Red Dead Redemption 2, the prequel to John Marston's journey to save his family at the cost of his former gangster comrades, gave us not John's perspective of the group's downfall, but rather that of a trusted, loyal lieutenant of the gang, Arthur Morgan. And damn, was it a good perspective. From the beginning of the game, you know that you will eventually see the downfall of the gang, and as you go along, you see how the cracks begin to form. How the conflict of old-world outlaw ideals were facing their certain demise in the face of a new, impending century of enforced order and civility. Over the course of nearly 60 hours, we got to see Arthur's struggle to survive and keep the gang together as setback after setback, mostly at the gang's own doing, increasingly stressed everyone to the breaking point. Most importantly, their charismatic yet increasingly delusional leader, Dutch Vanderlyn. In true Rockstar fashion, the tale was told with a grand attention to detail, interspersed with bouts of anarchistic buffoonery. There was so much to love here, even despite the game's predetermined conclusion. I could probably devote a half hour just talking about this game alone, but I've got to get going on this list. From the story to its characters, to its incredible world put on display, to the myriad of emotions the game puts you under, there's far too much to discuss here. It's overwhelming. It really is. Like everyone else here, I adored Red Dead Redemption 2, but unfortunately, it doesn't get any higher than the number 8 spot on my list. I think it's a fair bet to say that id Software is one of my favorite developers out there, thanks to their cavalcade of incredible games they've been putting out since the early 90s. While I played a number of PC games back then, we never really had the best machines on the market in my house to play some of the platform's more demanding titles. Case in point, I spent the second half of the decade invested in console gaming, and thus I never really got to dive into Quake or the majority of the id Tech 2 brethren until long after release. 2016's Doom answered the question of whether you could recreate a 90s shooter's fun gameplay and level design with today's visual fidelity and gameplay design paradigms. As to whether it was possible to do the opposite in today's day and age, though we've seen a great number of titles attempt to do so in a throwback style, I don't think that any game has been able to so accurately capture that old school feeling than Dusk. I'll admit, I wasn't excited for Dusk, at all. However, in the back half of December, when I was hoping to wrap up my Game of the Year list, Carlos insisted that I believe the term was not be a punk bitch, and gifted me a copy of the game. So, on a whim and without any particular interest in entertaining the game for more than a single stream, I started it up. And holy damn was I blown away. Dusk is a bit of a slow burn of a game. Probably stemming from its time in early access, but once you get past the first episode, the game just goes absolutely apeshit. Enemy design gets more varied and challenging, the level design really starts to show its some creativity, and even the story, paper thin as it is, starts to draw you in. I cannot emphasize how well done the levels are though, as the variety on tap in episodes 2 and 3 will repeatedly stun you with just how good they are. And then there's the soundtrack. Holy crap. It's hard to describe just how rockin' it is, and how deliciously on point it is to match up with their 90s aesthetic. I've made it no secret that a good soundtrack will tilt my opinion of a game almost unfairly, and Andrew Hulshut's metal head-banging tracks are astounding. I initially didn't want to try it at all, but Dusk surpassed all of my preconceived expectations. I love it, and you deserve to give this one a very hearty chance. Like I spoke earlier about Yakuza, I've never really been a fan of the God of War series. After having rage quit during the ending boss fight in the original game between Ares and Kratos, I paid the series no more attention afterwards until the newest titles were revealed at E3 2016. Featuring a bearded Kratos with a sun set in a world of Norse mythology, this was clearly not the over-the-top violence fest that the series had been known for. Though it came out back in April, I was indisposed and never really got around to picking it up until this past December, and thanks to a slow month and a quiet winter vacation, I decided to give the game a try. And holy crap, was it one hell of an experience. It's hard to put into words just how surprised I was by just how much I enjoyed this new God of War. While there was still the brutal level of violence the series has been known for, the scale of it was reduced significantly, though not to its detriment. Rather, these same frenetic engagements were made more intimate, encouraging more tactical one-on-one engagements and preserving the series' stalwart sense of scale by pulling the camera in over Kratos' shoulder, making enemies still feel very imposing and instilling in you that, yes, this is indeed still a God of War game. The story of the game is where I think God of War really shined, though, as Kratos and Atreus' mournful journey was both wonderfully acted and strongly told. Watching this character who, for 6 different previous titles, had very little depth or motivation other than angry man gets angrier, turn into this remorseful, estranged father learning patience and how to raise his young son on a quest to fulfill his wife's dying wish, all the while being pursued by the gods of the realm, was a fantastic thing to see, and something I wasn't certain Sony could really pull off. And yet, they did, making God of War one of the best told stories of the year. From the world to its characters and everything in between, God of War is a return to form that Sony is rightfully proud of, and for the first time in the series, I'm actually very excited to see what comes next. As I had previously mentioned in my 2016 Game of the Year list, Hitman is a series that I discovered later than most. To this day, I still adore Blood Money, and I almost feel like an apologist for Absolution, a game that had good ideas to it, but lost itself in trying to evolve the Hitman formula. It turned out the answer to what Hitman would really need to do was not necessarily evolve into something else, but instead expand on the core ideals that made the games, or the series for that matter, such fun to play. Hitman Season 1, a sort of soft reboot for the series, was a phenomenal entry, impeded only by its episodic content release schedule and the limited selection of maps by which to hunt your targets on. A second season of Hitman was assured, but the wait for it has felt pretty tumultuous. Thankfully, IO Interactive decided to finally let us take on this role of Agent 47 again, and this time in a fully fledged package instead of a steady drip of DLC. This new entry is everything that a Hitman game is supposed to be, and so much more. I could probably spend a good half hour alone talking about why Hitman is such a good game, but let me instead just tell you a story. In the game's 4th level, you are tasked with killing 3 different targets: a Bollywood movie director, a slum queen, and a mysterious third target that changes appearances, something previously unseen in my Hitman experience. At the start of the mission, I entered an apartment building wherein Diana alerted me to some unusual activity on the upper floor. Investigating, I discovered an incompetent sniper who was planning to kill the director. Instead of taking him out for encroaching on my target, I instead decided to help him. I infiltrated the construction site the director was in, set him up with a meeting with a famed artist, and, as he walked near a window overlooking the slums, the sniper fired, killing the target. Shortly thereafter, I tracked down the sniper again, having moved apartments and already set up for a seemingly second target. Sorry, buddy, but you only get one, I decided, as I snuck up on him and knocked him the fuck out. Checking out his pad, I found out that he'd been hired by the slum queen to kill the director. So, as one could, I decided to cash in on the completed task. After all, I did all the work, didn't I? I went to a payphone and called her, to which she thanked me for my efforts and promptly hung up. And then a curious thing happened. Diana reported that the phone number in question was immediately calling another number. It soon became apparent that the recipient on the other end of the line was none other than our third mystery target. And she wanted to meet. Oh boy. In disguise, I went to the train yard wherein the slum queen had made her throne. I watched and waited by the entrance, looking for a suspicious, interested party who might be my third target. It didn't take long for him to appear. I then quickly moved to the back of the train yard, wherein a series of commuter trains have been passing by every few minutes, where there just so happened to be a split junction for the tracks. Using Hitman vision, I tracked my 2 targets from afar until they met up in a train car located on tracks that matched and linked up with the commuter train tracks. I think you can see where I'm going here, but I'll spell it out. I found a railroad spike, and I was able to divert the commuter train onto the derelict track, derailing the train and causing it to slam into the Queen's car, killing both of my targets at once. This is just one of the many, many ways to take out your targets in Hitman 2, and you'll never find yourself bored with figuring out new ways to how to do so. There is so much to love about Hitman 2. The only thing that can be found at fault here is the number of maps to play on, which remains, like Season 1, at only 6. Still though, what's on display here can be pretty stellar, and is worth potentially dozens of hours of replayability. Hitman 2 is everything the sequel needed to be, and then some. It's more than worthy of being my number 5. It's been my opinion for a while that Spider-Man games haven't been special for a long time. Stan Lee and Steve Ditko's most famous creation has been a staple of gaming since the 8-bit era, but it wasn't until Sam Raimi came along and gave the character a proper cinematic debut, 17 years ago by the way, let that sink in, when we would see Spider-Man games really come into their own. Since the beloved Spider-Man 2 came out in 2004, there have been 8 AAA releases to come out, but none of them in general, in my opinion, have ever been able to recapture the magic that the second film's tie-in game had. 2 years ago, however, Sony unveiled an exclusive Spider-Man game for the PS4 being developed by none other than Insomniac Games, the guys behind the Ratchet & Clank series, and most recently, the underrated gem that is Sunset Overdrive. It still strikes me as odd that a number of people thought that Insomniac wasn't a proper fit for the franchise, but man, am I glad that they were so wrong. Insomniac's take on Spider-Man is, simply put, probably the best video game iteration of the character ever created. From the very beginning of the game, you know that you're not playing a Beanox derivative title, no offense to them, as you swing through New York toward Fisk Tower as police cars follow you, sirens ablaze. Swinging feels just as good as it did when Treyarch got it right the first time back in 2004, but 14 years later, Insomniac has seemingly perfected it by reducing collision issues that would otherwise slow you down, and instead turning them into momentum boosters that allow you to potentially increase your speed or more easily redirect the player in the direction they want to go. Combat has been massively improved upon as well, as it adopts a similar system to Rocksteady's Arkham formula. In addition, Insomniac has included a strong stealth system that was a delight to play. Hell, even the game's inclusion of sections in which you play as other characters such as Mary Jane felt really good, even if they were a bit basic in scope. I'm just saying, Insomniac, just throwing this out there. If you wanted to do a Mary Jane investigative reporting game, and you fleshed out the non-web crawler stealth mechanics, I'd be all for it. Of all the improved elements, though, the narrative is where I think this new title stands out amongst the pack. Spider-Man 2018's story is well written and gives us a tour de force of events, characters, and villains that complement, and often outshine, the various appearances we've seen previously. We're given a Peter Parker that's in media res, years into a superhero career, still struggling to balance his work-life after-work schedule, but unlike previous setups, he feels confident in much of his abilities. But most entertainingly is the ongoing mentor-mentee relationship between Peter and Otto Octavius, and though it won't go into spoilers, I will say that it should be considered the benchmark for heroes and supervillain relationships in Spider-Man games going forward, let alone other superhero games that may come out one day. Insomniac Spider-Man is without a doubt one of the best superhero games to date, and stands atop the pile as the best game in the titular character's library. At this point, the only reason you're allowed to have not played this game is its console exclusivity. No excuses though, you gotta play this game. If you ask me what it was that drove me to give the first Valkyria Chronicles a try, I probably couldn't give you an accurate reasoning. What I do remember is distinctly enjoying the vast majority of it, only having quit out on what evidently was the second last mission of the game, after having been distracted by some other game that came along. As I never got a PSP back in the day, I never got to try the follow-up entries in the series, and having seen that a third entry wasn't even going to come stateside, I'd pretty much written the series off. So it was a delightful surprise to me when Sega announced that, in the wake of their rather disastrous launch of the PS4 exclusive Valkyria Azure Resolution, that we'd be getting a full-on proper numbered sequel to the core Valkyria Chronicles series. I was hopeful, but cautious. After all, it had been nearly 10 years since the first title released, and the remaining entries had been released only on handhelds. Upon playing the demo of Valkyria Chronicles 4 at E3 this year, and netting a very sweet-ass hat, my worries were quelled significantly. This was a return to form that I hadn't anticipated, but I'm incredibly happy with what we got. Valkyria Chronicles 4 feels like the proper console sequel we should have received in the wake of the first game, in almost every aspect you can think of. You'll still experience that same sort of character development and camaraderie you got in the first game, with a strong assortment of characters of greatly varying personalities, backgrounds, and motivations. It's still that same turn-based third-person tactical gameplay that encourages thought and character routing before aiming down the sights and pulling down the trigger. It's the same watercolor-esque visual design with vibrant colors that make war look quite gorgeous. There's very little here that's substantially different, and to some that might be a little disappointment for a fourth entry in the franchise. Now, to an extent I agree with this argument, but I see why Sega did it. After all, Azure Revolution was not only too different from its predecessor, it made for a relatively mediocre RPG. A fourth numbered entry in the core Valkyria Chronicles series shortly thereafter should logically then be much more traditional. However, it does feel a tad too safe for what we probably could have got. Still though, Valkyria Chronicles 4 is a tremendous game that hits on all the right notes. The difficulty balance is such that no level in the game ever really feels like a drag, and there's a fair number of strategies you can employ to get the job done. The squad stories, a new feature of the series, is where I think Sega put on an applaudable amount of effort, as you get to spend a significant amount of time with your squad mates that aren't part of the main cast. Completing these stories, and meeting special conditions of some of them, flesh these characters out very well and give you proper stat bonuses for each one. This, in turn, encourages you to mix and match your squad mates regularly and turns what would otherwise be a 15 to 20 hour game into nearly 40 hours worth of content. Valkyria Chronicles 4 is quite simply a delightful game. It's a proper nostalgic sequel to a beloved game from the last generation that seemingly didn't have a future ahead of it. Sega did a great job with this one, and I can only hope that it has done well enough in their eyes to perhaps justify a fifth or even sixth entry in the series. Mechs. I love them, you love them, everyone in their right mind loves them. And if you somehow don't love them, you're simply wrong, and you should, I don't know, jump off a cliff or something. While I didn't get to experience any MechWarrior back in the day because my dad and I simply couldn't get it to run properly on our PCs, I've always had a fondness for the series, and I've always been interested in this post-extrasolar sci-fi dark age that is the BattleTech universe. When Harebrained Schemes announced the BattleTech Kickstarter project back in 2015, I was a bit skeptical. Sure, it was from the creators of the franchise, and certainly seemed ambitious, but the developer was one whose previous titles, which were the Shadowrun Tactics games, didn't really grab me, and I was more interested in a full-on proper MechWarrior experience. Still though, I backed the project and reserved my judgment for the final release back in April. After 80 hours of play, dozens upon dozens of planet drops under my belt, and hundreds of racked up kills, I can most assuredly say that I love this game. I'm normally not one for tactical games, but over the past few years I've grown fonder of them, thanks in no small part to the success of Firaxis' work on the XCOM titles. Sitting down to BattleTech, however, was an exercise in rethinking how to approach turn-based tactical engagements such as these. It took me a bit, but after having earned my first medium-sized mech and starting to level up my mech warriors, I quickly fell in love. It's fair to suggest that I probably spent 10 of those 80 hours just focused on upgrading my crew, my ship, and most importantly, managing my mechs. Traveling from system to system, it was rare that I ever felt like I couldn't take on a challenge, unforgiving as this game can be. BattleTech's randomly generated side missions make sure that, while I may experience the same map a number of times, the types of enemies that I will engage and their pattern of deployment and movement rarely felt the same. I love the eventual meta strategy I developed with my crew, using one mech as a giant missile carrier to barrage a target from afar to greatly reduce its stability, often to the breaking point, and then using another crew member to knock it down with a second sustained blast, and therein knocking that unit back in the turn order and giving me a fair shot at a critical attack. By the end of the game, I felt damn near unstoppable in everything except the 5 skull difficulty contracts, which guaranteed regular attacks by hordes of heavy and assault mechs. Still though, deploying my king crab and watching as it pretty much destroyed most enemies in a single attack, and then following up with my rest of my crew, felt incredibly satisfying and never boring. BattleTech, in the end, is every bit the MechWarrior experience I wanted to play, but simply with a different playstyle. This year we'll see the first actual numbered MechWarrior sequel in nearly 18 years, and I can only hope that it strives to be just as good as what BattleTech is. Until then, I look forward to trying out the various expansions that are in the pipeline, and continuing to lead the most badass group of mercenaries in the galaxy. If you're a tactics fan, do not skip out on BattleTech. The little game that could. That's what I wish I could say about The Messenger, the freshman title from Sabotage Studio, published by Developer Digital. I wish I could recount how I followed its development from announce to release, that I talked about every trailer of it and played every super secret developer press build that they ever created. But I can't. Because as much as I would love to say that I was the proto-Messenger hipster, I knew exceptionally little about it. In fact, I only really knew 2 things for certain. That it was purported to be a faithful fan tribute to the original Ninja Gaiden trilogy back on the NES, and that the director of Ninja Gaiden 1 played a demo and enjoyed it. While I was never fortunate enough to own a copy as a kid, I did rent it a number of times from the Hollywood video down the road and became quite fond of it. So seeing a modern take on the classic ninja platformer was something I definitely wanted to give a shot. And then I played it. From the opening moments in the ninja village as the Demon King's army invaded and the Western hero handed our protagonist the scroll, appointing him as the messenger, I was struck by just how well the game was starting. The controls felt tight, the visual design was right on for what an 8-bit throwback title should be, and the music, oh god, the music was extraordinary. I didn't stop playing for hours, engrossed in the great linear level design, the simple but challenging platforming, and the tales from the mysterious blue-robed shopkeeper that had me laughing unacceptably loud in the bedroom of my apartment late into the night. I ascended to the sacred summit of the mountain, my final destination, thinking that I was about to enter the endgame, and the game was disappointingly short for the $20 price of entry. And then the messenger traveled through a time warp to the future, and everything changed. No longer was this an 8-bit linear platformer, but rather a 16-bit Metroidvania light. The full scope of the messenger's journey was laid bare, through some hilarious consequences, and I was tasked with a second greater quest, completely changing the direction of the game. It was at this point that I knew the messenger was going to be on my list this year, but probably much lower on the totem pole. But I kept playing, backtracking through the levels I'd played before, exploring the new geometry, going through temporal portals to solve puzzles in both time periods, and eventually discovering entirely new levels thanks to character upgrades and enhanced items. From giant bats to trimmers like giant worms, an underwater cave labyrinth to the ruins of a city in the skies, I got to experience an incredibly diverse set of levels, all interconnected by entrances and exits set in different time periods. All of this was accompanied throughout the entire experience by an intuitive control setup that felt very tight and responsive, not to mention a soundtrack that was absolutely phenomenal. Across 14 hours of gameplay, I didn't get to experience quite everything the game had in store, as some of the later optional platforming challenges were amongst the hardest I'd ever experienced in a side-scroller before, but by the end, I came away both incredibly satisfied and eager for more. There are many adjectives one could use to describe their game of the year. Compelling, intoxicating, invigorating, the list could go on and on. But the one overall that I choose to use to describe the messenger is this: fun. Over the 12 months of the past year, I robbed trains in the Wild West. I swung through the concrete canyons of New York as a superhero. I fought the disciples of a demonic cult. I took on an army of building-sized mechs, and I fought Norse gods while protecting my estranged son. But in none of these games was I as enthralled by the gameplay, the world design, and the absolutely incredible soundtrack of The Messenger. It was the best game I played all year long, and rightly sits at the top of my list of the best games of 2018. Alright Alright guys, that's it. That's my list of my favorite games from 2018. As per normal, I want to thank everybody for watching, and I hope you take the time to check out some of the games I talked about. I also encourage you to watch all the other guys' videos, because everyone did a really good job in these videos this year. It takes a lot to make these, so please check them out. I hope you enjoy them. Stick around with us, and I hope you have a great 2019. See you around.